Hello, this is Aaron with AaronOnAutos.com, and this is the Driving in Wyoming podcast. This week we're going to take a virtual tour of the Forney Museum of Transportation, which is in Denver, right downtown Denver, actually, Denver proper. This is an old museum that has been around for a very long time. It's a huge warehouse, and by huge, I mean huge in the biggest sense you can think of. It's just gigantic. Inside that warehouse are just a number of vehicles that really pay tribute to the transportation that we have done in the last, 150 years or so. We're going to focus mainly on the cars that are on display there. There are also trains, bicycles, motorcycles, a lot of really cool stuff in that museum. I finally got down there to take some photos, and I was amazed at the number of vehicles that are there. What you're going to see here is a slideshow of photography that makes up maybe a third of their total collection. The number of vehicles they have on display is vast. It's huge. And there are some of the coolest vehicles you can name from any period in history in early transportation, early motorized transportation, I should say. In this collage, you're going to see vehicles ordered not by how they appear in the museum, because they are generally grouped by age, but it's not precise. Some vehicles just are a better fit in a different section. So the way I'm going to present them is in chronological order. You will be seeing them from the earliest made all the way to the newest. The earliest vehicle on our list is from the turn of the century, and the oldest is a really cool little car that was made in 1981. Most of these vehicles that are going to be in this video here are going to be pre-1950, so they're very, very old and just iconic classic vehicles. Some of them are vehicles that the car itself is really cool, but the history that goes with it is even better. And we'll get into that with the vehicles that I'll be showing you here. So without wasting any more of your time, let's just jump right into this virtual tour of the Forney Museum of Transportation down in Denver, Colorado. The sooner you get a chance to go there, the happier you will be, trust me. We'll begin with this 1905 Franklin. This is a Type A runabout. Herbert H. Franklin was a die caster, and when he rode in an automobile, he decided that he needed to make his own. There had been people before him, but he really pioneered the air-cooled engine by creating a sort of auxiliary exhaust system which let out the hot gases before they had a chance to overheat in the cylinder, and it prevented flame from being carried along the main valves to burn them, which, would lead to leak compressions and stuff. This is just a exceedingly intelligent use of what was available in the day, and it saved a vehicle about 200 pounds. So this is just a really cool looking little car, and it's a pioneer of the air cooling that later became a big deal with Volkswagen and so forth. Very cool car. Next up is this Staver High Wheeler. This is a very good example of what carriage makers were doing, swapping carriages from horse-drawn to running on engines. This one in particular is interesting because for about 2 years, from 1907 to 1909, they made this particular model with a 2-cylinder engine. That's very unusual because it didn't take them long to figure out that they needed 4 cylinders in order to get the vehicle moving down the street fast enough for people. But these types of vehicles operated very well in that time because there just weren't the roads that we're used to seeing today. They have the wide track that most wagons did. They have these tall wheels that are very thin. They don't get very good traction, but they stay on the road. They don't fall off or hit the rut. So very interesting. This was built as both a 2 and a 4-seater. So it was a buggy or an auto buggy. They usually called them auto or motor buggies. And it's interesting that at the same time there was this overlap. There were these kind of buggy cars, and then at the same time they were making a regular automobile, what we would envision as a car. This 1908 Overland is a runabout Model 24 and is one of those cars that just is iconic of that time. This is what every great car looked like then. The Overland company itself is very, very interesting because of just kind of how it started. But this car itself is very large. It's very heavy. It's not large, but it's very heavy, and yet it's only using a 5 horsepower water-cooled engine. It's a little single-cylinder engine with a 2-speed planetary transmission with a foot pedal to shift it. But it used jump spark ignition. It had a 2-way switch plug for changeovers between batteries. And in fact, it had one of the first automotive security systems. You pulled the plug out and took it with you so that nobody else could start your car. This was a very advanced vehicle at that time. Very cool to see this. Next, we get to a car that I had never seen before this. This is a 1909 Empire. They call them Little Aristocrats. This car was made by a quatrain, of people, 4 very big names in automotive at the time, who got together and decided to make kind of a fast little car. It was 20 horsepower, 4 cylinders, and only cost about $800. $800, of course, was a lot of money at the time, but for a car, it was actually pretty cheap. Unfortunately, they were more interested in the racetrack that they were building than they were in the car itself. These 4 people were also the major people behind the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which everybody should know now. It's where the Indy 500 is held. They were also the people that created the 500-mile race on Memorial Day. So there you go. These are some big names in automotive even today. In this car, they built it for a year, and then they just kind of forgot about it. They got so interested in that racetrack that they forgot about the car, and it was sold to another company, and then pretty soon it just kind of went away and became another car. There weren't too many of these made, but there are a lot of cars that look exactly like it, because when they sold the Empire Motor Car Company to a group of businessmen in 1911, they continued making the car, but they made them as standard 4 and 6 cylinders, and they did a lot of other stuff to them that took away from the original idea. So this is a very, very cool one, and it's one that like I said, I had never seen this car before, so it's very, very cool. A contemporary of that Empire is this 1909 Maxwell. This is a Roadster A. It's a 2-cylinder 10 horsepower, but it sold to the same market that the Empire did. This one is exceedingly interesting, not this particular one, but this company, because Maxwell eventually became Chrysler. It came into existence because the guy who founded the company, his name was Benjamin Briscoe, he had a sheet metal company in Detroit, and he was contracting with a guy named David Buick, but he thought that Buick's car would never turn into anything, so he wanted to make his own. So here you go. This is what he made. It's a very cool little car, very nice, and obviously the company never died out. So you're seeing the beginnings of both Buick and Chrysler right here. Very cool. I'm going to skip ahead really quick here because I'd mentioned Buick. This is a 1912 Buick Model 35 touring car. Buick began in 1904, and all the way up to 1913, they did right-hand steering, so you'll see that this car is a right-hand drive. These are usually called 3-door touring cars because the right-hand door is actually a false door. It doesn't actually open. They made about 6,000 of these. And interestingly, at this time, the president of Buick was Walter P. Chrysler. You may recognize that name. This car was pretty posh. It had tall tires for a better ride. It had a folding split windshield, folding canvas top, Prestolite carbide headlamps, a lot of other cool stuff. So this is a pretty good example of the high-end stuff that Buick was making at that time. Next up is a very, very historic taxi cab. This is a 1909 Unic taxi cab. It has the unfortunate name of UNIC as its name. It's French. There were a lot of these built back in the time. They built them for about 20 years, and they were mainly sold as taxi cabs. Individual car ownership in France was not very common. Most people did not see a reason to own a car. The history behind this particular one is very, very telling. This car was built in 1909 and was in service on the road as a taxi when World War I started. It was commandeered by the French military and was used at the Battle of the Marne. If you are a World War I history buff, then you will instantly know what that is. One of the worst places to be if you were in the military or in battle at the time. This car was used to haul soldiers to the battle lines, and then on return trips would be loaded with wounded to be taken to hospitals in Paris, and the dead to local morgues. This car in the museum is 100% original. It's never been restored, and it was driven over 500,000 miles, although there was no odometer. This is a car that just makes you stop and think. World War I was easily the most horrible war ever fought. Some of the most deplorable conditions, and this car was right in the thick of it at one of the worst points in that war. Now, going back to 1912, this is a Vauxhall Roundabout Overland coach. These were made by Vauxhall Ironworks in London and designed by Scottish engineer Alexander Wilson. The first car that this company made was produced in 1903. It was a little chain drive one-cylinder vehicle. And eventually they built this car, which was a much more high-end vehicle, and it was made to be a overland, which is their version for touring car. One of the problems they had at the time were what were called road bandits. These were people that literally hung out on the roads around England because there was very little law enforcement, and waited for cars to break down because cars were always breaking down, and then they would take advantage of the people that were stuck by robbing them, even stealing their car, hauling it off. And so as a marketing means, as a way to get around that, as a way to build a name for themselves, Vauxhall decided to build this car, which is the most robust and redundant car ever made, at least that I know of. And this may be the only one that's still in existence. A lot of these, especially during the war, were crushed and turned into scrap metal to be used for the war effort in England. So this car has a dual ignition system, 2 magnetos, 2 coils, and 2 spark plugs in each cylinder. None of those depend on the other. 2 completely independent systems. Has 2 fuel pumps and 2 fuel lines that go all the way to the tank, also completely independent of each other. Each headlight, side light, and tail light is wired separately, and every circuit has its own switch and fuse. So any one thing going wrong would not kill the car. It was very, very robustly made. It was made so that it could go overland and not break down. So this is a very, very cool car, and you'll see that it's very posh. The inside, it looks like they just basically mounted couches into the car for seats. Very cool. And of course, no museum tour would be complete without seeing a Ford Model T. This is a 1915 Ford Model T. All Ford Model Ts had 4-cylinder engines. They all had 3 doors. There was no driver's side door at the front. There was an interesting reason for that. It was considered dangerous to exit the car on the street side, so the driver slid across to get out on the passenger side. But the passengers didn't matter, so the passengers had openings on both sides. Next, we have a car that I instantly recognized but had never seen in person before. This is a 1916 Detroit Electric. This is the Braham Model 60 Type 16A duplex drive. Of course, the longer the name of a car, the more awesome it must be, right? Detroit Electric was started by the Anderson Carriage Company. They began building carriages in the 1800s, moved to Detroit about then, and then around the turn of the century, I believe it was 1907 or 8, started building automobiles. A guy named George M. Bacon designed the first Detroit Electric car. So what you're seeing here is a 1916, which is kind of the pinnacle of these cars when they were building them. These had fairly high capacity batteries for the time. They had better mileage for one charge because of that. Their steering mechanism eliminated vibration in the steering lever, which is an interesting little thing. They used aluminum for body panels, the battery hoods, fenders, and the window frames. And the roof was a one-piece from a solid sheet of aluminum, so it would not leak or crack. They had wire wheels, perfection door window lifts, and a lot of other stuff. And these were considered the doctor's car because they appealed to women, doctors, and other people who wanted dependable and a car that they didn't have to crank over because it was electric. Detroit Electric quietly kind of disappeared just before World War II. This car right here is called the duplex drive because you can drive it from either the front or the rear seat. And you'll see from the interior shots that the seating is basically just living room couches bolted into there. It's just awesome, though. This is a beautiful car, and it's in great shape, and you'll see it still retains its California license. Very, very cool. Moving on, here we have the 1917 Kissel Car Double Six. Double six is just a term that means V12. This one's interesting because its displacement is 390 cubic centimeters or 6.4 liters, and it develops only 80 horsepower out of that. And this is the only one left in the world. The photos I took of the full car itself didn't come out very well, and the car is not really that interesting in terms of its design. It's all about this engine. The company in total produced about 35,000 automobiles, but only about 150 are thought to be around out of all of that. And 5 of those are in this museum. So you'll see the name Kissel come up more often in today's podcast. Now we move to a fun one. This is a 1922 Samson truck. It's the model E15. It had a capacity of 1 yard. It sold for $1,522. This truck could haul about the same as a team of horses, which is around 1 ton of gravel or 40 bushels of wheat, but it could do it 5 times faster than that team could, and it was advertised as being able to pay for itself in less than a year. Today, just by comparison, the same type of truck can haul about 30 times this load and do it 4 times faster than this truck could. So it would do the equivalent of 600 men and 600 teams of horses. So you can see how far we've gone in just a few years. This concludes part 1 of our tour of the Forney Museum of Transportation in Denver. Our next half, the second half of this, will be about this long and will include some really beautiful cars like the 1923 Hispano Suiza, a 1923 Kissel that was owned by Amelia Earhart, and even some more commercial vehicles like we've shown so far. So stay tuned for that. This has been Aaron Turpin from AaronOnAutos.com. Talk to you again soon.